Welcome to this Clark Lake Spirit Foundation Salute to Veterans. When you think of what military veterans have done for our country, it's no wonder we have a day devoted to them. Veterans Day was always special at our house when I was growing up and still is. Both my grandfather and father are veterans.
Growing up, I used to watch a lot of military shows with my dad, 20th Century Fox. He was in the Coast Guard, my uncles were in the service. So we always talked military things. I didn't have much of an interest in around the 1970s with Vietnam going on and the anti-war protests, things like that. But then I was in college. I was there about 3 years and didn't quite have 2 years credits, and I needed a different direction to go to. So I just thought of the military at that point. I joined the Air Force. I became a precision photo processing specialist. We downloaded and processed, developed, and interpreted aerial reconnaissance from F-4s. I was lucky enough to be stationed in England for about a year and a half. I'd like to acknowledge and congratulate the veterans this year. My father's 95 years old. Like I said, he was in the Coast Guard World War II. And those were the guys, those were the real heroes. We don't see too many of them left.
Well, I'm 95, and I was in World War II.
To my sisters and me, my dad was always larger than life. We didn't realize until recently what a hero he was in the war.
After the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, we all enlisted. I was very patriotic, I guess you could say.
Dad joined the Army Air Corps. He flew a P-51 in the war, and one day he was on a mission over Europe, and they were strafing. The plane in front of him was blown up. He swerved off, and his plane was damaged, but he was able to make it back to England. He didn't realize that his landing gear had been damaged, so when he landed, he crashed. He knew immediately on impact something was terribly wrong. He had broken his neck, and he was paralyzed from the neck down.
I couldn't feel anything below my neck. Although my chest was very, very painful. And so they sent me home and recovered completely, ultimately, after about a year.
After a long recovery, Dad had a change of heart, and he took his life in a new direction.
Because I was taken care of by doctors, I decided I wanted to be a doctor instead of a lawyer like I sort of planned on being. And then along the way, of course, I met my wife, who was in med school, and fell in love with her. And that was the start of a very long relationship.
To avoid the draft, I decided to join the Navy, and in the aviation area. My dad was a pilot early on, so I thought that would be a good place to start, and I wanted to be a mechanic. However, after boot camp, I went to training, and instead of getting into mechanics that I thought I was best suited for, the Navy decided to put me in electronics. After spending quite a bit of time going to A schools and things, I caught up with the USS Bonhomme Richard and VF-211, which was a fighter squadron. The ship was dry docked in Japan at the time, and I came on board. Then immediately was transferred into plane captain division. As plane captain, I was in charge of the F-8 fighter jet, which was a leading MiG killer at that time for the U.S. Navy and Air Force. All the plane captains and everybody aboard ship, there was quite a camaraderie. We were there to do a job and do it correctly and get the war over with as soon as possible, even though it was very controversial. To us, we were on a mission to protect the U.S., and that was it. And to this day, I feel that was still a just thing that we did. And everyone that was involved in it and all the lives that were lost weren't lost in vain. We still are a free country. I thank the military for teaching me a lot of discipline, respect, and things. Sometimes I don't always show it, but I honor our country and our flag very much. All the veterans, thank you for everything you did, and it was great working with everybody all through the years.
Obviously, at that time of in the world things were very unsettled, and I really felt like I needed to be a part of defending our country and being involved in what was going on. And because it would help me in school, I joined the Reserve Officer Training Program, the ROTC program. And because I was in engineering, I went into the Corps of Engineers branch in the ROTC program. After graduation, I immediately went on active duty, first to my engineer officer basic, and then there was a rude awakening when I got orders to go to South Korea for a year. My wife Nancy had to stay home and relocate back to Toledo from where we were living, and we had a 3-month-old baby girl that I was just barely getting to know. So we picked up stakes and moved, and I went to Korea, and I spent my year in Korea, not very far away from the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. There wasn't really any active fighting going on over there, but it was a very tense situation. There were an awful lot of remnants of the war. You could look at the hillsides, and they were still denuded from the war that had ended 20 years ago. I spent half of my time living in a tent, building roads for the South Koreans, and then I spent the other half of my time at Tongduchan at Camp Casey, and I was a facilities engineer there. So that was a little bit more like a normal Army job. The first 6 months, I won't say it was like Boy Scout camp, but we were definitely out in the field. And I experienced a monsoon and had absolutely no possible way to think about what a monsoon was like until I lived through one. Basically, you just hunkered down during the time of the rain and waited till it was over. You picked up the pieces, you dug out your equipment from the mud, and you moved on. We lived in tents. And the luxury of our situation, because I was in the Corps of Engineers, we actually had concrete floors in our tents that we poured with the equipment that we had over there. Most of the other guys weren't so lucky they had dirt. I was thankful I didn't have to go to Vietnam, but I didn't really enjoy being away from home and my wife and my new baby at that time.
Veterans Day is special to me because I am from a family of veterans. I personally am a Vietnam War veteran. My father served as a pilot in World War II in Europe. My grandfather served as a doctor in France during World War I. My great-grandfather was an infantryman in the Civil War. And I am a 9th generational descendant of a Revolutionary War Continental Army veteran. Veterans Day, the origin is that the signing of the peace treaty and surrender following World War I was signed at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month. And the thinking at that time was that World War I was the last great world war. I was in my sophomore year at Jackson College when it became my turn to serve. We had a lottery system back then, and my number was drawn, and so to avoid being drafted, I enlisted in the Army. I attended a military language school and learned the North Vietnamese language. I was shipped to Vietnam, and my job during the Vietnam War was to intercept enemy voice communications and translate those communications into English. My tour in Vietnam was a 1-year tour, unlike tours today in Afghanistan and Iraq, which can last up to 16 or 18 months. While in the service, I worked for the Army Security Agency, and we reported to the National Security Agency. I had a top secret cryptographic access security clearance, which is the highest clearance issued. We always joked that if one of us mishandled any small piece of classified information, we would live out our existence in the prison at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Today, the sanctions for mishandling classified information are obviously much different. My personal welcome home party, so to speak, was when I got a chance to walk in the Memorial Day parade on Memorial Day in 2016 with the American Legion in Brooklyn, Michigan. There are veterans that served in a combat zone, and combat veterans who carried and slept with their weapons and fought the enemy hand to hand. Locally, we have a combat veteran from the Vietnam War, and that's Walter Reed.
Like all officers, I wanted to command. That's what drives us. And after about 5 months as the maintenance officer of a unit, two of our unit commanders in the same unit, B Troop, one was killed and the other was sent home with some serious wounds, and I was given the command. We took over after the command had a rough 3 days with the North Vietnamese. I commanded for about 6 months, an armored cavalry unit. We busted brush with armored vehicles. My troop, B Troop, 1st Squadron, 1st Cavalry, had about 35 armored vehicles. On any given day when I went out into a combat zone, we took 20 or 23 of our combat vehicles. We were looking for the enemy, and usually they found us before we found them, and they would start with sniper fire or a mine. My primary was always cavalry. Cavalry's job is to seek out the enemy and fix them so that other combat forces can pile on. In our case, most of the time, we found the enemy and there was nobody to pile on. We just piled on. In that 6 months, I lost 11 of my troopers. And you always wonder, what could I have done to save them? In most cases, not much. It was mines. I think of veterans every day. I've been active in the Memorial Day Parade here at Clark Lake for several years. When you've served with them in a combat zone, you learn that they're willing to give their life, and of course, in our case, 11 of them did. Veterans Day for me is every day that I talk about or talk to veterans. I like to walk up to them when I see them in public places and shake their hand and say, welcome back. And of course, if I'm wearing my hat, they say, welcome back also. I have personal feelings for about 100 veterans that served with me for 6 months in Vietnam. But on Veterans Day, we got to honor them all, especially today, because they served voluntarily and put their life on the line. But even back in Vietnam, when they were drafted, they didn't run. They stayed. They loved their country. And as I said before, I don't think any of them regret having served in Vietnam. Most of them are old like me and will humorously say, if they need me again, I'll go back. They don't need old guys, and they've done their share. So I proudly hail veterans on Veterans Day, Memorial Day, and every day when I see them.
I joined the Army in 1992. At the time, I was not ready for college, and I was looking for a little more direction in my life. I was talking to my recruiter, and he offered up the position of 91 Bravo Combat Medic, which I thought sounded very interesting, and so off I went. So I had many duty assignments that remain special to me for their own unique experiences, except one I'm quite fond of is my participation in Bosnia. Shortly after the Dayton Peace Accords were signed in 1995, my unit was selected to secure all of the main supply routes in Croatia leading into Bosnia. The experience was unique and challenging in that things, especially in the military, don't always go as planned, and you need to be able to adapt to unique situations and overcome obstacles. And many times that means being creative and resourceful when many people think that you don't have any resources or creativity to pull from. It was a hazard duty assignment. It was a former war zone, and the people that were there weren't all excited that we were there, and it did create some unique situations. At the end of the day, I was able to go back to that area and see the result of our efforts, and it is now a peaceful area, and I did see communities rebuilding themselves, and it's nice to be able to feel that you had a part of bringing peace to some good people that deserved it. Veterans Day, to me, is a celebration of the men and women of our armed forces that have done a little extra and have and given quite a bit. You know, they give their time, they give their energy, and in many cases, some have laid down their lives. They're the cornerstone and the foundation of the sacrifice that makes this country great. And we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the sacrifices and gifts that they have given us. And so it's just a moment to appreciate how we got here.
On behalf of the Clark Lake Spirit Foundation, thank you to our Clark Lake veterans and veterans everywhere.